The senator from Utah.
It's December, Mr. President, and so America's attention turns once again to the great debate of our time. What's the best Christmas movie? Is it White Christmas? Maybe Elf? A Christmas Story? Home Alone? Die Hard? That's a good one. A lot of people are partial to It's a Wonderful Life or Braveheart. Now, Braveheart, of course, has nothing to do with Christmas, but it's about freedom, and nothing says freedom quite like Christmas. We have to debate, you see, the best Christmas movie out there, for the simple reason that we also have to watch every year the worst Christmas movie. The worst Christmas movie is the one that runs every single year from this chamber, right here in this city on C-SPAN, just the week before our Lord's birthday. It's called Omnibus. Critics and fans have loved to hate it for years. And as is always the case in these money-grabbing sequels, the actors and the writers and the directors are just mailing it in. They know they can do this every year, and it works for them, and so they mail it in. The only plot twist this time around is that instead of a continuing resolution or a single omnibus, leaders and appropriators have cleverly put the negotiated spending agreement into two bills so that we can all pretend that it's better than just one. Even though they were negotiated at the same time, released to the public at the same time, and will be voted on within only minutes of each other. We've had different formulations of this over the years. Sometimes it's a continuing resolution, sometimes it's an omnibus, sometimes it's a couple of minibuses capped off with another continuing resolution. Sometimes we call it a cromnibus. This time, I think we could call it a double-decker minibus. But whatever you want to call it, it's the same movie. It's a rerun, and it's not very good. In fact, it's really, really bad. The secretive, undemocratic, irresponsive, and ultimately irresponsible process that produced this bill is nothing short of a sham. But then again, so is the substance of the bill itself. It's been like this for years now. Instead of actively setting and passing budgets within which we intend to stay, as we expect from any other organization, we make it up as we go along in as abusive and dysfunctional a fashion as the American people will possibly let us get away with. Because that seems to be our aim. Do whatever they let us get away with. In fact, the last time Congress passed all of its respective appropriations bills in each of the dozen or so categories in which we spend money, and we passed each of those bills unbundled and on time, it was back in 1997. For this fiscal year, we've already passed 2 continuing resolutions. Now, an omnibus bill in and of itself doesn't have to be a bad thing. In fact, one could make it a relatively good thing. You see, an omnibus could, in theory, be a decent legislative vehicle. If, and only if, that is, members of the House and the Senate were given time to read it and to debate it and to offer and consider and vote upon amendments to offer improvements to that legislation. And so I really don't care whether it's a dozen individual spending bills or a small handful of minibuses or whether it's a single bill. What I want is consideration on the floor of the Senate in front of the American people so that they can be aware of what's happening, so that we can be able to exercise the election certificates that we fought for so hard. Each one of us is made more relevant when we get that opportunity and less relevant when we are denied it. Unfortunately, it's just never the case anymore that we have those kinds of opportunities to debate and discuss and consider amendments and to receive the underlying legislation in enough time for any of this to make a difference. These bills, Mr. President, are written entirely behind closed doors by a small handful of leaders from 2 parties. Thousands of pages of spending, trillions of dollars, and released to public scrutiny for the first time within only hours of what would otherwise become a government shutdown. And you see, this is a feature, not a bug. For those in charge of this process, this is a good thing, because this is what allows them to write it on their own. The law firm, as I sometimes describe it, the law firm of McConnell, Schumer, Pelosi, McCarthy, and a small handful of staffers and a few other members around them write this bill, and then it's presented to us as a single binary take-it-or-leave-it package. You fund this and everything in it, or you fund nothing. You vote for this package, or you're blamed for a government shutdown. It's not right. This we somehow managed to call, rather euphemistically, bipartisanship. And like too much of what Washington calls bipartisanship these days, these spending bills are a fiscal dumpster fire. You see, they're masquerading under the banner of bipartisan compromise, when in fact they are collusion. Collusion just by a small handful of members of Congress who don't have to have their provisions debated and discussed and subject to amendment. On the merits, and not just on the procedure, this bill is a dumpster fire. Discretionary spending will be set at record high levels in nearly every category of government spending. This omnibus, or double-decker minibus, as I sometimes call it, will add $2.1 trillion to the national debt over the next 20 years. By that time, we'll be spending more on interest on the debt than we do on national defense. This, Mr. President, is embarrassing. It's embarrassing to the American people. It ought to be, especially embarrassing to those of us elected to represent our respective states in the United States Senate. What has historically called itself the world's greatest deliberative legislative body has become something substantially less glorious than that. When we had $1 trillion deficit after the 2008 financial crisis, everyone admitted it. Everyone admitted that it was a problem, that it was reckless and out of control. President Obama admitted it. And now we're borrowing just as much, and we're doing so at the top of the business cycle, with wages up and unemployment at record lows. It's an awful, corrupt cycle on repeat. Congress breaks its own spending rules, creates new ones to spend more, and then breaks the new ones and tries to hide the evidence, racking up ever more national debt all the while. What's worse, we're willingly putting the brunt of the cost of all of this on future generations, on those who are not yet here and not able to vote for or against the politicians who are doing this to them. Gorging ourselves on debt to the tune of another $1 trillion a year means that we're saddling our children and our children's children with the cost of this bill, and we're setting ourselves up for disaster come the next inevitable recession. Now, John F. Kennedy famously said that to govern is to choose. But Congress's defining dysfunction is that it doesn't choose. It chooses not to choose, rather deliberately. We don't budget, we don't reform, we don't prioritize. We just spend. And we hope that we're retired or, let's face it, dead when the bill for our negligence and recklessness finally comes due. Not only does this package feature reckless spending, but it includes many bills that it should not, with Congress funding broken, inefficient, and in many cases downright harmful programs. For instance, this bill reauthorizes the National Flood Insurance Program, a program that might sound nice, but it subsidizes beachfront properties right in the middle of dangerous floodplains, and which is already in more than $20 billion of debt to American taxpayers for a full year without a single reform. This, by the way, after every single time it's been reauthorized for years running. We have discussed, I and others have been promised, that the next time around we'll have an opportunity to offer amendments. We'll have an opportunity to reform the flood insurance program. It can be reformed, and it must be reformed. We've been promised reforms for years, but this bill just reauthorizes it for a full year without a single reform, not one. This bill also maintains the broken status quo for overseas contingency operations. For those Americans who aren't familiar with this term, or OCO as it's sometimes described, this is the Pentagon's increasingly unaccountable and widely abused slush fund, insulated from scrutiny by unchecked budget caps. The deal appropriates another $71.5 billion for OCO, a $4 billion increase just from last year alone. This, Mr. President, only days after America learned that civilian and military leaders have been lying to the American people for years across multiple presidential administrations about our failures in Afghanistan. Instead of reform or oversight, these bills would put another $4.1 billion into the Afghanistan Security Forces Fund and limit our ability to negotiate peace and bring the war in Afghanistan finally to an end. In an era of rampant fake news, even the media is outperforming Congress on this issue. These bills include $495 million for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a 13% increase from the last fiscal year, and the highest appropriation it has had in 17 years, all for a program that has been of particular detriment to my state of Utah. The LWCF has been used as a tool for the federal government to gradually acquire more and more land, even as it's failing to care for the lands that it already owns, with a current maintenance backlog of $19.4 billion. Worse, in addition to funding broken programs, it funds blatant, abusive cronyism. The bill reauthorizes the Export-Import Bank, Washington's favorite among favor banks, which doles out taxpayer-backed loans to help American exporters. And it does so for a full 7 years without even so much of a word of debate. This notwithstanding the fact that the Export-Import Bank has been the subject of very intense debate in this body for many years, and with good reason. Why? Well, among other things, the biggest recipient of Export-Import Bank funds is Pemex, Mexico's infamous, corrupt state-owned oil company. So corrupt, in fact, that its own employees collaborate with Mexico's drug cartels to facilitate the theft of their best oil and of their refined petroleum products. That theft has, in fact, become so rampant that in Mexico there's a term coined to refer to that kind of theft. Those who engage in it are called huachicoleros. Huachicoleros. We are funding, and we are insulating from the ramifications of that theft Pemex, a corrupt institution that doesn't operate well, in part because it's the victim of theft, and in part because it's being backed up by the United States government. And ranked right after Pemex is the People's Republic of China, whose state-owned enterprises are granted generous American taxpayer-backed financing for purchases they could fund through their own communist government. Now, say what you want about China, about U.S.-China relations on trade, about military issues related to China, whatever national security issues we might be concerned about with China. But I don't know many people, in fact, I don't know anyone outside of this town, Mr. President, who thinks that the United States government should be propping up China. Should we be giving money through the Export-Import Bank or otherwise to China? That's not our job. That's not the role of the U.S. taxpayer who works hard every day to earn money, which then might be sent to a communist government in China. The reauthorization even includes provisions instructing the Export-Import Bank to pretend that it's helping Americans to compete against China at the same time that it's sending that very government billions of dollars. And then there's the extension of the Brand USA Act, a 7-year reauthorization of a government-chartered nonprofit, Brand USA, to use tens of millions of federal dollars to advertise for tourism. To top things off, a last-minute tax extenders deal was added to the package late on Monday night, diverting billions of dollars on central economic planning and picking winners and losers in the marketplace. Over the next 10 years, this package provides about $2.7 billion in tax benefits through programs that use the tax code to incentivize businesses to invest in government-selected neighborhoods, seeking to control the flow of investment instead of relying on the free market to make those decisions. And it includes naked handouts to cronyist special interests. For example, it spends over $2.1 billion for subsidies on the energy sector. Not energy generally, but to specific winners within the energy industry that this small handful of purported leaders in Congress has decided will benefit from the hardworking taxpayer dollars that will be doled out. The bill, among other things, engages in awarding $113 million for coal production on Indian lands, $331 million for facilities to refuel alternative fuel vehicles, and $1.5 billion for biodiesel and renewable diesel tax credits, for instance. As if the federal government weren't already mired sufficiently in this area, this bill devotes even more. Beyond these, it hands out $187 million in write-offs for owners of motorsport entertainment complexes, $18 million in tax breaks for the production of movies and TV shows, and $3 million in tax credits for the purchasers of two-wheeled plug-in electric vehicles, just to name a few examples. And not only that, but it features new levels of absurdity, too. This deal actually includes a special interest bailout to make up for the failures of a faulty pension plan, while at the same time authorizing another pension plan to follow in its same footsteps. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for an additional 3 minutes.
Is there objection?
Congress authorized a group of coal miners' multi-employer pension plans under problematic rules, allowing them to underfund the plans by over 70%. But all the while, those pensions still promise their workers full benefits, setting up unreasonable expectations for their return on investment. Inevitably, they have not made up the shortfall, and now the taxpayers are being asked to bail them out. And in the very same bill in which we're bailing out the coal miners' pensions, we're authorizing a select group of community newspapers, not all newspapers, not all media enterprises, just a select group of hand-picked community newspapers to follow the same practice, allowing them once again to underfund their workers' pensions, while again promising them a full return on benefits. With this bill, we're rubber stamping the expectation that employers are free to raid from their workers' promised retirement benefits for their own short-term gain, and setting the precedent that the government will reward this bad practice by bailing them out when that inevitably becomes a problem. This bill, however, does include some good measures that I support, like repealing the medical device tax, fixing a tax provision that would unfairly subject churches to more taxes, and making retirement account reforms that allow Americans to access these funds in times of a particular need. And sadly, I, like many of our colleagues, will be forced to vote against these measures because they've been lumped into this massive, stinking package where the only choice we have is a binary one. We have no option to vote for the things that we like. This is wrong. There is no finite cap on our ability to debate these things other than the artificial ones that we have created rather deliberately within this body, and that's wrong. The thing about these omnibuses is they put us in a take-it-or-leave-it position. We're given no choice but to support or oppose the whole thing, good and bad measures alike. Unfortunately, just like every other episode in this squalid saga, I'll call this one Omnibus 2, the bussening. This one, too, will come to a predictable, sad, sorry ending. Congress will pass the mess, indulging in a process, substance, and long-term result that are all an affront to the viewers. Because at the end of the day, the audience members are real-life victims. We can do better. We can, we must, and we will. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.